Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. I would like to take a moment to let everybody know that we have lemonade, apple cider, and water in the back on that cart if you would like some. My name is Lauren Mauricio, and I'm the president of the COS Green Club here on campus. This is only our first semester as a club, but we already have 5 dedicated members strong. A few weeks ago, we phone banked for Kenneth Mejia for Congress, a Green congressional candidate in the Los Angeles area. We also participated in the COS Halloween Carnival, and in a couple weeks, we will be hosting a political forum with the Young Democrats Club. But this event may be the one that we are most excited about. I would like to take a moment to thank our advisor, Eric Hetherington, right there in the middle, and our friend Fernando Serrano from the Green Party Tulare County for making this event happen. Thank you so much. Dr. Jill Stein was the U.S. Green Party's presidential candidate in 2016 and 2012. She's an organizer, physician, and environmental health advocate. In the 2016 election, she was the only national presidential candidate to call for a Green New Jobs program for healthcare, jobs, and free public higher education as human rights, for a welcoming path to citizenship for immigrants, and for demilitarization with a foreign policy based on international law, diplomacy, and human rights.
Yes.
She was also the only candidate to be arrested for supporting the Dakota Sioux Nation and resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Since the 2016 election, she has fought for election integrity through a recount initiative that continues today. She is currently helping to launch Green Uprising, a new home for peaceful revolution that is working to turn resistance from the last election into rebellion in the next. So without further ado, please help me welcome Jill Stein.
Thanks, everybody. It's really so exciting to see all these new faces out here, new to me at any rate, and just really exciting to see people getting together because this is such a breaking point moment. You know, we got the fires in the north and in the south. We got the air pollution that's, you know, right here in our neighborhoods inside of our homes. We have the drought that, you know, people are really feeling in so many ways. We have the heat. They're talking about possible fast floods now in the areas that have been burned out. We have the long-term impacts of agribusiness and the fossil fuel industry here in the San Joaquin Valley that have really created a crisis across the board, practically whatever area you look at, whether you look at economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice, the plight of immigrants and workers, all of this happening inside the context of really an empire that is teetering at the brink as we spend half of our discretionary budget on wars for oil, where largely black and brown people are paying the price, and we're creating, poverty and insecurity and violence world over. And, maybe I should just say right off the top that for those people who are concerned about an immigration crisis, how about we stop causing it in the first place? With NAFTA Colombian farmers out of work in Mexico, for example, with the coup in Honduras, which is the major source of the migrant caravan, the refugee caravan, largely fleeing for their lives. And what a shameful commentary on the state of U.S. politics and this White House administration, that it has been trying to use that caravan of wounded, sick, just distressed families, mothers and children, as an opportunity to score political points and exercise nothing less than demagoguery. This is the makings of fascism. This is how fascism takes hold, which, all of which says that, we have a real crisis right now. We have a crisis in our hands. It's really a breaking point. And it's so important. I should mention, of course, that another really critical element that the communities of the San Joaquin Valley have done such a fabulous job of bringing to light is the crisis of toxic pollution and the impact of pesticides, not only on farm workers, but also on whole communities, because there are studies now documenting, if you didn't sort of know it just by intuition and common sense and reason, there are studies that make very clear now that this is a hazard to everyone. In fact, this so-called CHARGE study, which was done, I believe, in 2014, testing the blood of infants, newborn infants, to see if they had residues of toxic pesticides. I think it looked in particular at chlorpyrifos, but it may have been a larger category. But the point basically remains the same, that toxic substances are being used, pesticides are inherently toxic, and the exposures are not just confined to farm workers, which is outrageous enough as it is that people are sent really into the line of fire, into these known hazards. Where are the OSHA protections? Where's the occupational health and safety for this very vulnerable group of workers? Well, it's actually the whole community, because there's drift, and when the pesticides are applied either by airplane or by these spray guns, there are families not only living on the border, but within half mile and a mile who actually receive the drift. So it's 87% of newborns that have detectable levels of pesticide residues. And I want to just acknowledge right now, because there are many people in the room, would you just give a wave if you are a member of the coalition advocating for pesticide safety, so we can give you a big hand and a big really important work. It really drives home that if we want to protect all of us, we really have to protect all of us. And that means especially the most vulnerable. In this case, it's farm workers and frontline communities. And whether we're talking about pesticides or police violence or drought or fire or floods, we really need broad-based protections, because at the end of the day, we're on one boat, We're on one boat. If you're talking about the economy, it's not okay to have 0.1% that has the resources of 90%. It's just staggering. Did you see the report the other day that the richest man in the world, who is Jeff Bezos, makes in 10 seconds what he pays his workers for an entire year? That's 10 seconds. He makes, excuse me, something like $120,000 an hour, I think it is, and $28,000 every 10 seconds, roughly. This is not okay. Not only is it unjust, but it also creates an incredible concentration of power. And there's a saying that goes, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when you put that much wealth into that few hands, it's just a setup for waste, fraud, and abuse, and for the exercise of power, whether it's through backroom deals or the pay-to-play political culture that we have, or the reality that we live in a political system right now that is funded by big money. You know, and that doesn't work. That doesn't work for all of us. If it's not working for the most vulnerable, then you can be sure we're all kind of in the target hairs. And you know, in that sense, what's happening here in the San Joaquin Valley is so important because it's sort of a picture of where we're going, you know, that if we allow agribusiness to write the rules, if we allow the fossil fuel industry, they are writing the rules, you know. If we allow them to continue to write the rules, this is big trouble. And I just want to comment briefly on sort of this moment we're in. It's a moment, I think, of crisis, unprecedented crisis, but also of unstoppable resistance. And the kind of resistance that we're seeing on the front lines right here in the San Joaquin Valley, in Tulare County, for example, you know, it's very exciting how the fight is being led, whether it's by, you know, by the undocumented, by the DACA students who stood up so courageously. Can we just give a round of applause? Whether it is the indigenous tribes at Standing Rock, who, you know, they're not just water protectors, they are human rights protectors, they are climate protectors, and above all, they are democracy protectors, because they are asserting and have been asserting our democratic rights to protest and to advocate for redress of grievances. That's why we have the First Amendment, the right of free speech, a free press, and the right to protest. Those rights are incredibly under fire right now. You know, whether you're looking at censorship on Facebook or censorship actually in legacy media as well. Does the name Prop or Not ring any bells to people? You have to be kind of a geek to have tuned into this stuff. But Prop or Not was a website, or it still is a website, but it was launched by the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos' newspaper, as it happens, which essentially initiated a whole new wave of censorship. And what it did was accuse like 100 or more websites and advocacy groups of being Russian influenced if they advocate for peace or if they are progressive groups. So in the same way that Black Lives Matter has been accused of being a Russian puppet, I'm a Russian puppet, in case you didn't know. The, you know, environmental groups are, you know, accused of, you know, we're all sowing discord, as they say, as if we don't have, you know, internal discord right here. And I just have to mention that a study done last week on Facebook that was released by the New York Times, I don't know if people tuned into this, but it sort of made the point that the biggest, shall we say, the biggest engine of discord on social media is none other than Facebook. It's not just who gets promoted on Facebook, it's Facebook's own practices of disinformation, of attempting to sabotage and attack its critics. And its whole business model is based on fanning the flames of passion and hatred and anger. That's how stuff gets propagated. So that's why Facebook has become the best friend of authoritarian governments and authoritarian politicians who have worked their way into office using the power of Facebook to amplify campaigns of hatred. And you know, that goes not only for Donald Trump, but also for Narendra Modi in India, for Bolsonaro, if I'm saying the name correctly, the latest right-wing president that's risen to power in Brazil, that many of these right-wing authoritarians are actually riding the waves of discord being sown on Facebook in a way that Facebook itself inherently propagates. And the bottom line there is that when you get to be so big that you have over 2 billion memberships, and what is it? It's over, I think, it's over 2 billion messages a day that are posted on Facebook. You know, so when they talk about, oh, how terrible the Russian internet agency was because it posted 30,000, you know, messages, 30,000 out of 4 billion a day, you know, is what, you know, have you learned anything about mathematics? You know, the number has to be evaluated in the context of what's happening. So the bottom line is that when an organization gets to be that big, you know, it really needs public interest principles. What does Facebook know about, you know, running an organization with that many people and doing it in a way that serves the public interest? You know, it's just not possible to do that with a plain old profit motivated business model. And if we do want to have social media that serves our interests, we need to ensure that we, you know, that we have to protect our rights across the board. And that means not only protections against censorship, because you know who Facebook uses to exercise their censorship right now? They use, I think it's, well, one is the what is it called? The Atlantic, it's not the Monthly. I'll check the name or it'll come to me in a moment. But it uses two very conservative right-wing organizations to advise it. The Atlantic Council, that's who I'm trying to think of. And the Atlantic Council is basically the think tank sponsored by NATO, by the US government and the EU. So it's an extremely, shall we say, militaristic oriented organization. It has a very explicit kind of neocon agenda and warmongering agenda and censorship agenda. So, you know, what are they doing? But, you know, how is it that NATO essentially is advising Facebook on how to, who to censor? You know, that's extremely dangerous. There needs to be a higher standard of public interest applied to censorship. Not that there aren't very dangerous things on Facebook, but the most dangerous thing about Facebook is the way that it propagates hate. You know, so I think many people who study this would argue we need to fundamentally change the mode of operating of Facebook. But censorship is not the answer. We have to stop a machine, an engine that's essentially designed to propagate hate and fear and racism. You know, that the problem is very central. And bringing on organizations like the Atlantic Council, the other one I think is the Monthly Review, or maybe it's the National Review. It's another sort of basic, very conservative media organization. So that's not who should be, you know, deciding what's dangerous, you know, because what we've gotten is essentially the silencing of progressive voices. And, you know, it's anti-war groups, it's Black Lives Matter, it's the Real News Network. You know, it's a variety of progressive organizations, including our own in the Green Party, where our reach on Facebook has been cut by about 90% because of these algorithms that are used. So, you know, it just makes it all the more important that we find other ways to keep building, that we support local and community-based media, that we network with each other, that we promote stuff on Facebook. You know, you can have a network of propagators, independent propagators, that help get out, you know, important news and information. And I should mention right now, one of the organizations I'm working with right now is called Green Uprising, and as Lauren mentioned, its purpose is to help turn resistance from the last election into outright rebellion in the next, and to enable us to create pathways of communication, to support candidates, to support Green Party chapter development, and to support social movements. We're going to pass around a couple of sign-up sheets. If you're interested in helping to create this alternative communications network, just, you know, sign, you know, give us your contact information, basically, if you're interested, and we'll follow up. discussion, and I want to at least touch on the two subjects that were addressed in the title of the talk about education and jobs, which are just so central to everything else, and I think really central to liberating a generation of young people who are trapped in student debt, virtually unpayable student debt. Does that seem like a problem to people here in this room?
Yes.
Would you say? Yes. Okay. I mean, from my perspective, it seems like it's the gateway problem, because it's very hard for us as a society to solve problems unless we have unleashed the vision and the forward thinking of our younger generation. Every society relies on its younger generation to figure out the next steps forward. And if people are strapped in unpayable student loan debt, that together with an economy in which 95% of the jobs created since the crash of the economy in 2008, 95% of those jobs have been low-wage, part-time, gig economy, insecure jobs. So how does a whole generation find the work when there just aren't new, good-paying jobs coming online? That doesn't mean many jobs available that pay enough to just wipe that debt out. Instead, you're kind of carrying it and paying a lot of it. We'll get to questions in just a moment, so definitely scribble them down, because I would love to talk more about it and hear your thoughts. But the point I want to make is that this is a problem that we don't need to have from the get-go. Student debt is a creation of our new, set of priorities. And I would just mention here that as our political system has moved to the right, as money has become more concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, as the Democrats adopted the fundraising strategies of the Republicans, starting back in like the 70s and the 80s, and with the rise of Bill Clinton, this had really been perfected, and we had then the whole New Democrats, and we have, again, a whole new launch of New Democrats. There are good people who are really trying their utmost to do the right thing inside the Democratic Party, but unfortunately, the party is fundamentally structured in such a way that big money rules the day. And if I can just digress into the history of this, so you understand the context of this problem. It didn't just begin. It didn't just begin with Bernie Sanders, who was one of those, really inspirational fighting spirits who said no corporate money. And that's how he powered his campaign. That's why he could take the very principled positions that he took and that he still takes for the most part, with a couple notable exceptions, particularly around the military, which to my mind is not a small detail here. Our budget is mainly a military budget with a little bit of window dressing that doesn't leave much room for paying for college and health care and housing and job training and job creation for that matter. So you can go back to the Second World War when Henry Wallace, who was Bernie Sanders on steroids during the Second World War, he was FDR's Commissioner of Agriculture, for one thing, and then he was the Vice President. And going into FDR's third term, and everybody knew he wasn't going to last, he was very sick. So the vice presidential nomination was essentially going to determine who would become the next president. He had enormous public support, and if you look at Oliver Stone's, The Untold History of the U.S. Are people familiar with that? It's an incredible resource. I strongly recommend it. And he has, incredible footage of the convention hall, which was just, wildly ecstatic for Henry Wallace. They shut the microphone off just before Henry Wallace was about to be nominated. They shut the microphone off. They adjourned the convention. They called a fire emergency, and overnight they pulled some strings, and the next morning, instead of this you know, flaming socialists. Instead, you had this neocon, Harry Truman, who brought us the Cold War, who dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and all that has flowed from there. So, you know, it was really an incredible, you know, disaster. But unfortunately, this is the mode that's been repeated ever since. And, you know, the rug was pulled out from under Bernie Sanders, which was exposed by the leaked or hacked emails, whatever they were. But, you know, they exposed election interference on steroids. So then Clinton and company made up a story about Russian interference. And that's not to say Russians aren't interfering. I would assume they are, because that's what we all do to each other. And the solution to that is not going to war.
Yes.
If that's a basis for attacking the guy that you interfered with, then we ourselves, you know, have brought on many attacks. Academics who study this issue of election interference have documented very well. And let's see if I can remember the name of the university, Carnegie Mellon has a very good database on election interference that goes back to the Second World War. And guess who has the #1 honor, you know, of most election interference? It's the U.S. And that's looking only at nonviolent interference. But if you add to that violent interference, like Libya or like Iraq, or like Honduras, or like Guatemala, or like Iran going back to the 1950s, Chile, yeah, you know, or like our death squads that we have, you know, propagated violence and, you know, economic domination in Latin America with, you know, and generated refugee caravans, you know, that all kind of go back to this. You know, what's that?
Don't forget Liberia.
And Liberia, okay, yeah. I don't actually know the story of Liberia, so we'll put that one on the docket for the future. We'll talk afterwards. Yeah, but I have no doubt. I mean, this is the rule rather than the exception. This is generally how U.S. foreign policy has worked. And, you know, many countries of Africa, you know, their stories are sort of buried and hard to get to. You know, I'm a latecomer to politics, so you guys are so far ahead of me by light years, I can't tell you. But, you know, I didn't begin to look into this stuff. I was an advocate, you know, and I kind of had my issues, but I didn't get political. I was an advocate, boy, you know, so I grew up in the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the anti-war movement, so, you know, I was an advocate there, but I never got political, and the Democratic and Republican parties never spoke to me. So, you know, they always just seemed way too corrupt. So I was never drawn into politics, and I worked on issues as a medical doctor, you know, training for medicine. I got very focused on health issues and worked to create a single payer system. We were this close to getting it in 1998 in Massachusetts. We were beaten back in a referendum because our legislatures won't pass these things, as you've noticed here in California. Same thing in Massachusetts, where we are wall-to-wall Democrats. We do not pass these things. You know, if you want to see what the Democratic Party is capable of doing, even with its progressives, you know, look at California or Massachusetts. You know, where we give lip service to some things. We're good on the talk, but we're not very good on the walk, and, you know, we see it burning up around us.
Firemen.
Yeah, you know, whether it's fires or floods or migrant, you know, deportations by the millions, the security state, you know, the prisons, the police violence, you name it. It ain't working, and it's especially not working in major urban areas, which are wall-to-wall Democrats again. You know, so there are constraints. There are good people, but there are real constraints, the constraints of big money. And what Henry Wallace was up against, what Bernie Sanders was up against, what everybody in between, whether Jesse Jackson, there was a whole movement built on the civil rights movement and the labor movement, which were strong back in the 60s and the 70s. They were extremely strong. You know, I think Black Lives Matter is still very strong. but the labor movement, you know, has had its legs cut out from under it, in part by the McCarthyism and the Cold War mindset, which has been, you know, reinvigorated now with the Democrats leading the charge, you know, with the Russia mongering here. So labor was, you know, has been in very bad shape. But back when it was strong, what did labor and civil rights try to do together? They tried to create a social democratic, Bernie Sanders type Democratic Party. This was back in the 60s and the 70s. And what happened? It floundered on the rocks of the Vietnam War. Because, you know, the Vietnam War was the, you know, the Democrats had long been supported by the war industry. And, you know, the war industry, which emerged out of the Second World War with incredible strength. Eisenhower warned us, beware of the military-industrial complex. So the, you know, the war industry essentially undermined the effort to reform the Democratic Party. There was a powerful effort because those two movements were at their peak, and they were thwarted. Remember the bubble of hope that surrounded Barack Obama?
Oh, yeah.
You know, and he went into the presidency, and he had an incredible public mandate, and he couldn't do it. So, you know, to my mind, this is not a series of coincidences that have been ongoing without exception. And in any single instance, you will have argued now that you have to hold your nose and vote for the lesser evil because this is the most important election ever. And, you know, I understand that in some ways, but on the other hand, you have to look at more than this election because while that is being argued, the whole system is marching to the right.
Yes.
So you may get a lesser evil in any one moment, but unless you have developed a place where you can really put your feet down and build a non-corporate, people-powered political party, whether you know whether you're talking a socialist party or a green party, to my mind that's not so much the issue. There are reasons why I'm a green, which in my mind encompasses socialism as well. There are minor differences, but the reason that that's really, really critical is that you have to have this basic system change if we're going to change the policies. And you gotta put your feet down and start building somewhere. So, you know, that's just a little digression because that question always comes up. Well, it is the most critical time ever. Shouldn't we all hold our noses and vote lesser evil? I think history has taught us that lesser evil still keeps moving us towards you know, a disaster of economic, environmental, and social injustice. Even though there are good people fighting as hard as they possibly can, you are part of a long line of very good people fighting as hard as you possibly can. And the big money funding both parties is very hard to fight when you're playing by those rules. And they write the rules in their own party. And if anybody doubts the power of the war industry to call the shots here, I urge you to check out Daniel Ellsberg's latest series of interviews. It's on the Real News Network. Are people familiar with the Real News? It's, how about Democracy Now?
Yeah.
Familiar with that? So and you know, they're very good. They're not entirely independent of corporate money. Maybe they are of corporate money, but many of their donors, shall we say, are, a little bit encumbered. So they're not as liberated as I would like to see them, but they do some great stuff, and it's really worth reading it. So that's democracynow.org, and the other one is therealnews.org, and you start with the. It's got really interesting pieces, but what I really urge you to take a quick look at is Daniel Ellsberg's, I think it's a 12-part interview. So Daniel Ellsberg was the whistleblower who blew the whistle and basically leaked the Pentagon papers that showed that the war in Vietnam was essentially a hoax, that the American people was being manipulated by a very purposeful campaign on the part of the Pentagon to make people think that we were winning and that this was going to be winnable, when they knew very well that it wasn't. And, you know, there were just horrible things being done. He leaked it, and, you know, and then he was hunted by the FBI, and, you know, he, fortunately, he got off without jail time. But he's kind of like the model whistleblower of modern times. So he's just issued another book, and this interview is based on that book. And it addresses really what's happened since the Second World War and how the whole Cold War was essentially manufactured. It was not needed. The war industry created an enemy so that it could be funded, essentially. I was ridiculed for saying this in the aftermath of the election, because this is kind of, you know, this is common knowledge, shall we say, among people who aren't on the payroll of our current establishment, political establishments. It's kind of common sense and common knowledge. And they don't like it when you speak these kinds of truths. But Daniel Ellsberg has a huge amount of credibility. People really respect him across the board. So I really urge you to take a look at that. I'm going to say 2 words real quickly. Do we have a hard stop time? 2 o'clock. Oh, great. Okay, good. All right. So we'll have plenty of time for questions. But I'm going to jump right now to student debt again, and then to talk a little bit about jobs. And again, student debt is, in my view, it's the gateway issue to unleashing a generation that's grown up with reality as it exists right now. You know, so your brains don't carry around how things were 20 years ago, which kind of were a little more, you know, hopeful. And, you know, we didn't have a climate crisis bearing down on us like a ton of bricks really fast. And we didn't have, you know, endless expanding war, making us less secure and bankrupting us as we go. You know, we didn't have an immigrant and deportation crisis, et cetera. So, you know, there's a certain just wisdom in being you know, having a clear vision of where we are right now and where we're going. So the bottom line is we can solve the student debt problem. Number one, we should be paying. That is, state governments should be funding public higher education, and it should be essentially tuition-free. We could afford to do this when there was far less wealth in our economy. We can certainly afford to do it now. And I can tell you what happened in my home state. I don't know all the details, but I have no doubt that the general principles are the same, which is essentially, in my home state, we created a $3 billion tax cut, you know, largely for the wealthy in my home state of Massachusetts. So there's $3 billion every year that's been, you know, given back to those who need it least, instead of funding programs like public higher education. And the impact is not only creating debt, but it's also creating incredible poverty in a generation. So the statistics say that approximately half of students across the U.S., about half of U.S. students in community colleges have either housing or food insecurity, and it's about 1/3 in state colleges and universities who have either housing or food insecurity. You know, colleges now commonly have food pantries. Yep. You know, and there's a lot of homeless students, you know, for whom there is no solution. And, you know, we've been approaching these problems, you know, very much under the thumb of the dominant industry. So how do we solve our food problems? You know, we go to agribusiness. How do we solve our housing problems? We go to big developers. You know, it's not rocket science, you know, that communities should have a right to implement rent control. You know, they should not be forbidden from doing that. That communities, you know, have a right to create housing and rules about inclusive housing and affordable housing, and the need to have, you know, affordable units, and that's a lot of affordable units in all housing that's being built. Usually it's just a little, you know, it's a little piece of window dressing on the housing, which is mostly being built at absolutely unaffordable levels and so on. So in terms of the student debt, public higher education should be free. We know that it pays for itself about 7 to 1. For every dollar that was put into free college on the part of the GI Bill following the Second World War, the federal government paid for public or private education for returning soldiers. For every dollar they put in, they basically got back $7. And they were, you know, they were watching carefully. They were keeping track of the numbers. And the results were incredible. It's more than pays for itself. And in terms of the student debt, which is now at like 1.3 or $4 trillion. Yeah, it's incredible. And it's about 43 million and counting students that are locked in student debt. So this is pretty outrageous. And how do you ever get out from under that? Well, how you get out from under that is the fact that 43 million is is enough to win just about any election. When you bring in your parents, you know, and your siblings, and then you bring in Latino voters as well. There are approximately 29 million, I think, Latinos who have the right to vote and who also need a progressive government and things like higher education and healthcare as human rights. You know, there's the makings of a progressive coalition here, and you know, 43 million students plus parents is enough to win virtually any local or state election if we actually elevate this issue and campaign around it. So it's very powerful and cross-cutting, and it can be done. How can we pay for it, people say? There are many ways you can pay for it. Yeah, that is one. We can just create the money. We did that essentially for Wall Street. To bail out Wall Street, we created many trillions of dollars. It's argued whether it was 4 trillion or was it 16 trillion, but we created whatever was needed right then and there. Right. What's the difference? You know? Yeah. But there's another place we could pay for it right now, even without fighting the battle to create the money. We can move the money. So right now we have $1.7 trillion on the table to pay for a new generation of nuclear weapons. It's not just the Republicans. This was Barack Obama's, you know, wonderful idea that we should create new nukes and new modes of delivery, new airplanes to drop the bombs, new submarines, and new missiles. And so that would be 1.7 trillion for a new generation of nukes. Well, how about instead of a new generation of nukes, a new generation of students liberated from we need the nukes like a hole in the head. And we should clearly, we have to get rid of the nukes, you know, on their own terms. Yeah. We should be banning nukes and signing on to the UN treaty, which would actually make new nuclear weapons essentially illegal, and it would begin a rapid phase out of all nuclear weapons, which is where we really need to go. So that's, you know, that's the nutshell on student debt. And on jobs, we need a New Deal, and we need a Green New Deal. We solved jobs problems before. We did this in the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression. We're told all the time that the economy is booming. Does anybody think that your economy is booming? No. Yeah, it's booming for maybe 5 or 10%, but for everyday people, it's a crisis. And by any realistic measure, 1 in 2 Americans are in or near poverty. And you know, the new jobs, 95% of the new jobs are low wage. And you know, 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So we need a really comprehensive and vigorous, high-powered solution here. So we're calling for a Green New Deal, which gives a job to everyone who needs one and wants one. You have a job. And it is a good paying job.
Yes.
And by the way, there are benefits also written into the Green New Deal in the form of an economic bill of rights that includes health care and education and affordable housing, but health care and education for free through college. So the Green New Deal would create approximately 20 million jobs. This is a lot. You only do this kind of thing when you have a national emergency. But if ever there was a national emergency, this is it. You know, this is sort of like the ultimate emergency right now, looking at climate change. And you know, the other problems are unconscionable, but we will not recover ever from climate change. We're really looking at the end of civilization as we know it. You know, when sea level starts rising, we got a whole lot of nuclear power plants that are along coastlines. So we're going to see, you know, Fukushimas all up and down the coast. You know, we're going to talk about mass migration. You know, we will see, it's predicted something like, I remember the numbers, I want to say 200 or 400 million globally, climate refugees predicted by, I think, the end of the century. You know, and it was 45 million last year that has thrown economies world over into crisis. Migrations are hard for the communities that are migrating, especially, and you know, stressful for communities on the receiving end to receive lots and lots of people. You know, this is a setup for disaster in many ways. It can even be done. You know, you have India, which is building electrical wire along its border with Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, you know, is very much at risk, and we could see millions of people fleeing for their lives and unable to do so. So it's just, you know, it's a disaster nightmare scenario if we allow this to proceed. So this is an emergency, just like in the Second World War, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, it was an emergency. How long did it take us to completely transform the economy? 6 months. 6 months. So the UN is telling us we have 10 years. So that's about what we're calling for, 100% clean renewable energy in 10 years. But not only that, we're also calling for, you know, public and energy efficient, renewably powered transportation. We're also calling for a sustainable and healthy agriculture system, which is independent of fossil fuels and pesticides, and which, you know, it's like breaking up big monopolies. Let's bring back the family farmers and the farming economies so that we can have the issue, you know, one of the most critical and immediate issues is toxics and pesticides. But when you begin to look at it from any other angle, how about water? You know, it's absolutely, you know, it has devastated the water supplies. The wells have gone dry, you know, throughout the San Joaquin Valley. People are forced to drink polluted water or don't have any water whatsoever. You know, if you look at the health impacts of agribusiness, not good. The way the food is handled, you know, it's all used to generate the greatest profit. And so that means that it's packaged, it's processed, its nutrients have been sort of lost in the process, and we've also lost access. You know, we've lost food justice, and we've lost access to healthy, sustainable, largely plant-based food. There's nothing more nutritious and healthy than fresh fruits and vegetables, but they are like nowhere to be found in the agribusiness economy. So no matter how you cut it, whether you're looking at the abuse of workers and the abuse of the migrant workforce and the immigrants who the industry relies on, so if you look at economically, if you look at worker justice, if you look at immigrant justice, if you look at water, if you look at climate emissions, if you look at public health, it's a disaster. It's good for the CEOs, but that's about it. And you know, the science is very compelling, increasingly so, And you know, it's not studied too much, you know, because it provides a dangerous, you know, new argument about the health impacts of this agribusiness food. But it's not good in many regards. There's also the issue of the pesticide exposures through the food. And there was a recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association published just a couple weeks ago about how your cancer risk seems to go down if you're eating organic food. And I haven't looked at the details of that study to know, is this because of pesticide exposures? Is it because you're eating more fresh fruits and vegetables if you're eating organic? I'm not sure, but you know, there are some very intriguing things here that should be pursued. The health impacts of this, you know, food should be studied. Our medical research apparatus likes to study things you can put patents on. Yeah. It doesn't like to study things like food, you know, which are way basic. We have a sick care system. We don't have a health care system. We make people sick through...
To be fair, they do put patents. That's GMOs.
Ah, that's right. If you call that food. And they changed all kinds of rules so they could label what is food, you know. So they now apply different criteria. I think it's like food-like substances.
What does that mean?
Considered food.
Food-like substances.
We'll come back to that. Hold on to that as a question here. But just to make the point, we can fix the, you know, we not only can, but we really need to. If we want to get out of here alive, we need to fix the food industry. So this is all part of that Green New Deal that would create the jobs across several industries that are needed, that would also restore our ecosystems. You know, our forests, the threatened sequoia forests, which should not be diminished. They should be absolutely protected where they are. It's a great threat to the health of the sequoia forest right now to be, you know, considering either logging or diminishing the size of those monuments, which the, you know, the logging industry is trying to do a disaster capitalism thing right now and use a disaster as an excuse to basically profiteer. So the Green New Deal is sort of the, you know, it's kind of where we really need to go. If the future matters, you know, this is the solution. If the future doesn't matter and we just live in this mythology of a corporate economy, it's not going to last very long. And I think people are seeing that in so many ways, between the fires and the floods, the economy that teeters on the brink, the continuing abuse of workers, the ever-growing economic disparities. It's not like we're making progress. We are moving in the opposite direction, and that hasn't been limited to Republicans. You know, this has been a bipartisan problem. At the end of the day, it's the fossil fuel giants, the war profiteers, and the big banks, and their, you know, associated usual suspects who are driving the agenda. We know this from everyday experience. We know this from academic studies, and there's some great ones out there, that this will not solve our crisis. And being a little bit less lethal, a little bit less evil, is not okay. We need something we can not only survive with, we need what we can thrive with. So I'll just conclude saying that we need to forget the lesser evil and fight for the greater good, like our lives. Because, in fact, they do. Our lives do depend on it, and that urgency is closing in on us in life and death terms every day. So this is the time for us to mobilize. We're really seeing this great awakening right now, what's going on in the Central Valley. And again, a salute to the folks from CAPS, who are the coalition, who really exemplify a frontline community standing up with their experience, their lived experience, their lived wisdom, and pointing the way forward. Courage is contagious. And the more we stand up, the more others will stand up. Remember, there are 100 million people who do not vote. And these are black, brown, millennial, and poor. That's what the studies tell us about who's not voting. Well, why in the world would they not be voting? Could it be because they've been thrown under the bus? by the two options that they're allowed to hear about. So, you know, and the American people are not only screaming for other options for a new major political party, but also for open debates. We have a right not only to vote, but we have a right to know who we can vote for. So there are concrete solutions here that can address all these problems. At the end of the day, the key thing is for us to stand up, to stand together, and to stand strong and create an America and a world that works for all of us. The power to create that world really is in our hands if we stand up and make it so. So thank you all for leading the charge. Okay, we'll start with those, and then the rest can think of your questions, because I'm sure it'll come up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I really like everything that you brought to the table today, and I wanted to talk with you about higher education specifically here in California.
Yes.
Are you aware that there has not been a new public university built in California since 2006, I want to say? In that time, we built about 20 prisons, if I'm not mistaken. And so I founded a nonprofit, a local nonprofit that is trying to fix that issue. And I guess that my question is, one day we would love for you to come back. I know all of us would probably love for you to come back to our area, and hopefully we'd like to have you come to something that we've gone to, because we want to change the way that our valley has been left behind when it comes to education.
Thank you so much. I mean, of course, I'm there, just tell me when. But, you know, this is, to my mind, this is the name of the game, is building this broader, really courageous, movement, you know, this force that gets how these dots are connected. Because the minute we connect with each other, then we are unstoppable. And to make the point, the connection here, you know, it's like the school to prison pipeline, you know, just taken up to another level. It's like the dollars are creating that, you know, we're shutting down education opportunities and we're opening up the floodgates to incarceration.
And I see I'm also an educator, so I see it all the time in schools. I see the kids that are from, I purposely go to poor communities because they have less opportunity. So
And I really, you know, encourage you also to connect here locally, like with the COS Greens, for example, so that we can keep this happening.
We know each other. I know that.
All right, terrific. Awesome. Very, very exciting. Yeah, all right, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Number 2, yeah.
Hi, my name is Brianna Guerrero, and I use they, them pronouns. I always introduce myself that way because I think it's important that we do that. I'm the president of COS Green Club, and as you guys didn't know, today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, and not a lot of people know that. And I feel like lately, especially under this administration, LGBTQ issues have become such under fire, and I think my fellow people in Pride Club and my fellow people in my community are just really scared right now because it's become such a huge issue, especially trans people. Like, they've become under fire almost every day. So I guess my question is, like, what can the Green Uprising bring for us?
Yes. You know, in my view, the LGBTQ community, and especially the trans community, which is probably most vulnerable, especially trans people of color, you know, who are really in the target hairs. You know, this is why we have to protect the most vulnerable. That has to be our standard. And protecting LGBTQ people is really critical, because in this moment of neo-fascism and racism and xenophobia, you know, trans people are right out there on the front lines, and I think we just have to be mindful constantly of protecting them, protecting each other, and including them as, you know, as part of our rainbow diverse coalition. We're all different in different ways, and we need to protect and respect those differences. So, you know, in terms of specifics, you know, there's just a whole agenda of health and mental health, of job protection, of protection in education, you know, access in public places, and that includes bathrooms and all that, that agenda just has to be lifted up and protected all the time.
Yeah, especially in the valley, there's hardly any trans competent doctors here
Yes.
that use correct pronouns, that gender people correctly, that give them the correct hormones for them, and can give them certain things. There's just nothing here in the valley for us.
Yes. We have a lot of work to do here in the valley.
Yeah.
Especially in the valley.
Yes, and thank you for your courage in standing up. It's very hard to stand up in places like this. Thank you. Yes. Let's see, who was third? There was one more person back there. Yes.
Andrew Chavez, I voted for you twice. I teach here. I like lifting the veil off of the military-industrial complex, the Raytheons, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grumman, that are making a killing off of the military-industrial complex. How these companies have hijacked the idea that not supporting our troops is this notion of them not getting their military contracts, because that's what our military has basically become. A lot of what we're contracting out to mercenaries, people who are now fighting our wars for us abroad. How do we deal with that hijacking of the idea of not supporting our troops and these individuals not getting their contracts?
Yeah. So it's definitely not easy. And to my mind, it's like every time I give a picture, I give a peace sign, to just like start infusing the issue of war and peace into everything. Because all things are happening in this context in which we are being robbed blind by this industry, which is making us less secure, not more secure. I mean, we really have to challenge this basic premise that this even serves us in any way. We have 800, at least, military bases around the world. If you add up all the other foreign bases of all the other countries who have them, it amounts to 30. We do not have a Department of Defense, we have a Department of Offense. And it has gotten us into incredible trouble. If you look at what's happening in Afghanistan, the longest, terrorism war out there, the Taliban have more territory today than they did when the war was begun. And we're absolutely ground down. We spend $4 million an hour in Afghanistan. It may be $10 million a day in Israel, which is another one we should not be pouring our dollars into while they are violating human rights and committing war crimes. We need to take over our government and democratize it and throw the bums out. For me, I've gone down many different roads. Before I became a political animal, I would think, environmental health will break through here because everybody's affected by pollution, right? And then you discover you're going to be beaten back. Or I thought that Medicare for all or single payer was, going to be the breakthrough because everybody needs health care. But there we got beaten back, within 2 percentage points in our referendum back in 1998. The bottom line is that we need a coalition. We need a broad coalition across groups. And it's not easy to build coalitions. And then the light went off in my brain. This was around the time I got tricked into running for office for the first time, back in the year 2000, in the governor's race, which was in 2002. But I was recruited on the 4th of July, actually, in 2000. So it was a memorable day. And the light bulb went off in my brain that, I needed to become a Green because we have to fight this. And coalitions don't. The only way to fight the power, the machine, is by building a coalition. Coalitions don't stay together by themselves. They require a lot of work, and you need a coalition across issues, across space, and across time. Once you start putting in the energy, to create that coalition and keep it together, that is basically a people-powered political party. And so I resigned myself at the age of 50 to becoming a political animal and at least testing the waters. And I did that by, as I ran for office. And I discovered that, oh my God, it sort of unleashed this really interesting conversation, to have a conversation. Because if you're taking marching orders from the DCCC, say, or the DNC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or the DNC, you got your talking points, and you're not supposed to talk about single payer, and you're not supposed to talk about immigration, and you're not supposed to make waves here, and you're not supposed to talk about the wars and what it cost us, and there are all kinds of stuff like that. But as a Green, I can talk about anything, and our party platform, to my mind, is absolutely right on. It's a really good platform. It's been created without corporate influence, without big money sponsors to worry about, so we can actually do the right thing. And I could have real conversations in my campaign events. We could have real conversations, and we could find all kinds of common ground, even right to left, and religious and right to lifers, and in Greens we could find all kinds of common ground when we're not kind of confined to these talking points that have been defined by under the influence. So that's a long way of saying, how we fight the war industry is by not just fighting the war industry, infusing the issues of war and peace into all discussions that we have, that this is why we don't have the money to pay for free public higher education. Their nonsense is so absurd that it almost isn't worth bothering with, because people who believe it are sort of religiously locked into that point of view and not especially subject to reason. The most important way to fight any issue, in my view, is by going to non-voters, which is the strategy that's been adopted. Greens use this all the time, and one of the city council campaigns in Tulare County, in Porterville, used exactly Daniel.
Woo, Daniel!
Who, as of yesterday, was within 5 votes. Wow.
Daniel, come
and
on.
it's still counting. He is catching up, and that was their strategy. And not to embarrass Fernando Serrano here, but he's very much a part of that campaign. And Letty too, of course. They've been, really creating a strategy for the campaign that is look to non-voters, and that's definitely where the power is. Because there, you don't have to change people's minds. All you have to do is help give people who already agree with you a reason to come out and vote. And then overnight, it's like Alice Walker has this saying, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have the power. It's all about creating strategies to use this. And I'll just tell you one more quick story. In that first campaign, we were locked out of the debates, of course, and people were not happy about that. Even in the year 2002, they did not like being confined to a choice between Coke and Pepsi, which was true in the governor's race all the more. And we had huge demonstrations, like thousands of people outside the debates that were screaming to open the debate. So finally, they were pressured into opening a debate, a televised debate, which took place inside a TV studio, so there was no live audience to actually talk to human beings, except for the cameraman. The person on the camera was, alive and thinking and kind of communicating. But everybody else in the room was either a candidate or the big media moderator. And I put out the usual kind of Green Party agenda of healthcare and education as human rights, of cutting the military budget in half, of preserving bilingual education, greening our energy supply, the usual stuff, and it all went over like a lead balloon inside that particular debate hall. Nobody was interested in that stuff when it was largely the political establishment inside that room. And so I was incredibly, oh, well, I tried. I did my duty. I bore witness. I said what needed to be said. Nobody liked it. That's okay. We got a lot of work ahead of us. Then we walked out of that TV studio, and I was mobbed by the reporters who told me that I had won the debate on the instant online viewer poll. And that turned the light bulb on in my head, and I realized the truth of what Alice Walker was saying. You know, I was not recognizing, you know, that we already have the power. And from that point on, it's like politics to me became easy street, you know, that political dialogue is simply about sharing the love, you know, and letting people know that there is a win-win-win out there, and we actually have the power to make it happen. And don't listen to the naysayers who are trying to hold us back, because they know that we have the power. They're quaking in their boots that their days are numbered, and that there will be a green uprising, you know, one way or the other, that, you know, this is what the future looks like, and we just have to stand up and have the courage to make it happen.
Amen.
Okay, let's see, there were a couple others who, did you want to hear it in the green flower? Do you want to be on the stack for a question?
I'm so sorry, I was taking this, please repeat that.
So we're putting together another group of questions.
Oh.
So if you have a question, I just wanted to put you in that group.
Oh, thank you, yes, I do.
You do, okay. All right, so you'll be number 1, and then 2. And
Oh,
then,
no, you answered my question.
yeah, I did, okay. 2, 3, the woman here, 4, 5. Okay, all right, great. Number 1.
Okay, so you were halfway through when I formed my first question. It's that a lot of people are saying that immigrants are taking our jobs. The Republicans often like to use that excuse. Well, a lot of people also don't realize it's not the Latinos taking the jobs, it's automatization of the workforce. Do you have any elaboration on that?
Yes, and also let me add that even aside from automation, that there's virtually no evidence that Latinos are taking jobs. In fact, Latinos are you know, expanding our economies and adding enormous wealth and creativity, and are very hardworking and create lots of small businesses and so on. So Latinos create so many jobs, pay taxes, and you know, and even the undocumented are paying taxes as well, and not drawing on services.
I'm sorry, I made it seem like the question was about Latinos, so I agree with you. I was trying to talk about the automation.
Yes.
That's the thing taking our
Yes,
jobs.
absolutely. But yeah, right. And I wanted to just be sure that that point gets in there, because it's like the presumption behind this argument.
I agree.
Yes, great. So thank you for clarifying. But just to get that issue straight. And you're right, automation is a huge problem, and then also you know, the trade deals that enable corporations to move their factories to where labor is cheapest. So it's all those things that are happening together that are problematic. And the way to deal with automation, you know, I think we have to just be sure that we're protecting the rights of workers. And a Green New Deal, to my mind, creates lots of jobs that aren't going to be easy to automate. For example, weatherizing homes and businesses. There are completely new types of manufacturing. Some of that could be subject to automation. So, you know, that's an issue. And whether we're protecting the jobs or we protect income, there's various approaches to this. You know, and so one of them is a guaranteed minimum income nationally to ensure that as our economy becomes more efficient, that we're not, you know, impoverishing, you know, most Americans who are workers. Yes.
And to my mind too, if we could expand jobs in the mental health sector, that is definitely something that we need, and machines cannot take that.
That's right.
So for me, that would be my solution.
And true for elder care.
Oh yes.
For all sorts, you know, for child care, and for teaching, you know, in particular as well. And nurses and physicians assistants, and restoring ecosystems is a huge one. So, you know, the job universe has been shrinking, you know, and the jobs that are being created now are mostly, you know, low wage, well, part-time jobs, and some of them are like in Amazon's, you know, warehouses and stuff, and those indeed are quite subject to automation. you know, extremely abusive, and, you know, across the board, we have to protect people, ensure that people have economic security and benefits and access to education and a meaningful future. And there are all kinds of ways that that problem can be solved. The essential problem is making sure that we have a government that's working for us, that's not working for the CEOs and the 1% who are benefiting from displacing workers, essentially. Thank you. Let's see.
Okay, so I'm not very politically inclined, but there is something that I've noticed in schooling. I feel like they don't really give us the basic building blocks like logic and reason, which should be infused into every class, by the way, you know. And so like people have this idea, because they have echo chambers, you know, like they just like listen to other people that, you know. And I feel like whenever I talk to people, they always say, oh, well, that's your opinion. And I'm like, no, I'm presenting you with measurable ideas. And people like just block that out. And I think that has to do with the schooling system. And I think I don't mean to get into, you know, whatever, but I think religion does get infused into that. I feel like we have like this thing where we don't teach certain subjects because they're controversial, and I'm just like, these are measurable ideas. You can see them because they're demonstratable, you know. But we don't have that kind of idea, and I don't know why that happens. It's not in every country. That's like a very American thing. What do you? I mean, do you think that that's true, or do you think I'm wrong? What do you think? I don't know.
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right. You know, we don't even teach basic civics and things like that.
Basic
like
building blocks are just
right.
left out.
Right. They are totally left out, and you know, education has been so whittled down over the last, you know, 2 decades, I'd say. I mean, it used to be much more, you know, and right, the arts and recreation and music and all the stuff that was considered stuff is really core to like how we
to expanding our brains. You know, and one thing that I find weird is that like because of that, even when you're presented with the actual like information, I'm not talking about like big loads of data, but just like demonstratable formats.
Yes.
Like people are so like just blocked off that they can't even. That's a problem. When you can't even understand how to understand, then we need to reconstruct the entire.
And let me add to that. When you know, we've seen recently an upsurge in all sorts of learning disabilities, as well as cognitive decline, you know, like Alzheimer's and similar forms of dementia. And at the other end of life, we see a lot of developmental disabilities and autism, for example. You have to ask, you know, is this just the tip of the iceberg? And is there a lot of sort of subclinical impacts on our brains? And there are recent studies that demonstrate, for example, that fossil fuel pollution is not just bad for your heart and your lungs, but it's also bad for your ability to think. It's also bad, it causes birth defects and is linked to developmental disabilities too, and probably to decrements in IQ and just the ability to think and learn and remember. And it's like we know that when people have lead poisoning, what's the first symptom of lead poisoning? One of the most sensitive symptoms is like the ability to socially communicate and to read social cues and to like be able to control your anger. And it's like these things that we take for granted as being able to think clearly are actually the product of many things working right. And when our food system is feeding us lots of really bad stuff, and we're breathing polluted air and drinking polluted water, you know, there's every reason to think that people are not thinking so clearly. So to my mind, and then on another track, we also know that fascism, which is, you know, in a way it's a kind of social psychopathology. You know, it's sort of this vicious surrender or takeover, I guess you could say, of a very violent kind of mindset, and it's sort of a rejection of basic notions of community and democracy, and an embrace of violence and authoritarianism. What is it that creates the outbreak of fascism? And it's usually when people, usually whole countries or major sectors of the country, are extremely stressed and have, you know, like in following the First World War in Germany, where Germany was occupied and was essentially subject to starvation for a long time. I mean, it was an extremely degrading, dehumanizing, and stressful experience, and it led to a whole generation of very vicious, violent fascists.
Desperation is not a good place. That's where you make your stupidest moves.
Exactly.
I always tell my friends, if you're mad, sleep it off. Think about it the next day. You don't make your best moves when you're desperate.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a social context for that desperation as well.
Yeah.
And we've seen that many people who voted for Donald Trump would have voted for Bernie Sanders. Who knows, they might have voted Green had they been able to see that as an option, but they did see Sanders, and they were gonna vote for Sanders, but they were denied the opportunity to actually heal their wounds, so instead they embraced this ferocious, bitter, angry, violent demagogue. And so when we think about how hard it is sometimes for us to talk to each other, there are probably many components of that. And one of them is like this health thing, like what's polluting our brain from our food to our pollution, pesticides and lead and all that, to the kinds of social stresses that people are under right now. We know we have an epidemic right now of diseases of despair, that there's been a surge in not only the opioid crisis, but also in suicides, especially teen suicide. We are in very desperate circumstances now, just using objective criteria, and that is a very bad sign. We have to address these social ills right now, not only for their own sake, but also so that we can kind of cool the jets, out there, and stop the fanning of these flames of hatred that develop when whole, classes of people are being abused and thrown under the bus.
The last thing I wanted to say, just real quick on this. Do you know what a war of attrition is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's what happens, and I think in a war of attrition, there's always some sort of winner, and it's typically not the two competing. And I think that trickle down I think what's getting fed is the poor and uneducated, and I think that's a really good position for countries to have a lot of times, to have a lot of poor and uneducated people. I mean, it's awful, but I think that's a reality, And I think having a lot of poor and uneducated people gives the 1% a lot of control. I think it does, and I could be wrong, but I think that's a real big problem.
Okay, let's see, I'm not sure I followed all of what
Oh,
you
okay.
said, but we can talk afterwards.
Yeah.
I just want to be sure that people have a chance to
Yeah,
talk.
yeah.
But thank you for your thoughts, and we'll straighten that one out afterwards. Others who, yes.
Yes. Earlier you were talking about how agribusiness negatively affects a multitude of pressing issues such as our economy, the water crisis, etc. And I was just wondering how you think the Green Party can help combat these agricultural issues, especially in the San Joaquin Valley and more importantly Tulare County, since agriculture is seemingly everywhere and makes up the multitude of our economy.
Yes.
Say that.
Yes, and I think right now what's going on in Daniel Peñalosa's race, did I say it correctly? Peñalosa's race is a really interesting test case, because do you want to just say a word about how how Daniel's race is in some ways a model of how we begin to mobilize the latent power of these communities to fight back for their own survival, economic, health, jobs, etc. And we're really close. Daniel is really close to prevailing, which is sort of a proof of principle. Whether he wins or not, in my view, he's already won here by demonstrating the principle. If he's not, if he doesn't quite make it, well, he's got a good jump start next time, and I think he's demonstrated how we need to move forward. So say a word about that.
Well, I think you already summarized the basic strategy, and that is to reach out to voters who are specifically affected by the agribusiness model that dominates not only Tulare County but the Central Valley. So I think that your question was mainly had to do with how do we agriculture is so important to our economy, and most of the people that live here are dependent on that one way or another. But the question is not whether we want agriculture here or not. Is whether we want toxic agriculture here or not.
Yeah.
So the switch to organic agriculture, to renewable agriculture. sustainable agriculture. That's what we want, to change the model. Not necessarily to get agriculture necessarily completely out of the valley, because so much of it, not only us here in the valley depend on it, but the country and the world. We export what we produce here all over the world. So it's not so much about that. So the model that we follow at the local level is that at the local level we need to mobilize to demand that from our communities, starting from Porterville, DNC, or Woodville, or the small communities, to demand that change. Because it's not going to happen if we just focus on the state or the national level. We need to start from our communities. So one of the things that we did is precisely reach out to non-voters, a lot of them impacted by the agricultural business, and then grow the movement from there.
So to paraphrase, what you were trying to say was you gotta like go to the root, like what is the culture surrounding agriculture, and ask yourselves, what's the current agricultural climate, how to like make that culture more progressive?
There you go.
Yeah.
She said it better than me.
And then, it'll be very interesting, I think, to look at other models for how to do agriculture at the community level in a way that is more just, which is holistic, which is organic, and begin to fight for the resources to begin those experiments. And that also might include some, renewable energy. So like we have fields of solar cells, but it'd be really nice to see them controlled by local, energy utilities, which are publicly owned or community owned, or which are worker owned, etc. There are many, ways to approach how to create a sustainable local economy given what you've got, and the opportunities to develop alternative agriculture and energy in particular are really exciting, and the sooner that gets going, the better. And it's not, what should I say, it should not be off the table to ask for resources from the state to be able to support the green transition here. And that's kind of the concept of the Green New Deal. And working with other communities also that need those resources. There ought to be, a billionaire's tax in California. There are lots of billionaires. I think we just passed a millionaire's tax, if I'm not mistaken. But our tax structure is so incredibly unjust. There is lots of room to move to acquire the resources to actually create these startups at the community level.
So what you're saying is that we should use tax money that we get from the state to help fund our local agricultural businesses, because most of them are fairly small and currently don't have the funding to switch over to these sustainable practices like larger companies do. Yes?
Yes, and it depends also on the financial kind of demographics locally as well, because like New York City, for example, has a local graduated income tax. So they can get the money from their local millionaires too. And every locality should have the right, to have a graduated tax base right now, or to make their property tax progressive. I mean, there are a variety of technical solutions to creating a progressive tax base. And you can do that locally if there are some local, are the wealthy, agribusiness CEOs living locally at all? Ranchers? Okay, yeah.
They don't live here.
Right. If they're all outside, then you may need a state level solution. But there are a variety of solutions that can be explored. It's not a lack of resources. The resources are there. Thanks. Yes.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming here and answering our questions. The question that I had was, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership typically was a free trade deal in order to make a bunch of countries in Latin America kind of promote their economies of ours. And it was kind of a response to the one—
Say that again, that would make our—
it would connect our economies together,
okay.
right? And it was a response to the One Belt, One Road initiative that China's doing with free trade. So my question to you is, how do we protect American workers? And also, does the Green Party stand for protectionism or isolationism? Like, what should we be doing moving forward to protect American workers while also remaining competitive to countries like China?
Yeah. So, just in brief, a couple principles about approaching that. And, you know, this really applies whether you're talking the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was really a corporate trade deal. And it was designed to benefit unaccountable multinational corporations. And its judicial system, for example, how it would judge violations and create fines, was essentially built on the World Bank and attorneys from the World Bank. So, you know, it was all really kind of a very global one-percenter kind of structure. You know, and if you look at NAFTA as well, workers were hit by NAFTA south of the border, and they were hit by NAFTA here. As we design trade, you know, in my view, the point is not our workers versus their workers. The point should be protecting all workers and protecting the environment, that should also be built in, that you can build in fact, a fossil fuel tariff. Fossil fuels are crossing borders. There are ways to build in social progressivism and environmental protection into these kinds of laws. And, you know, if you look at the kinds of global trade programs that are promoted by the trade unions, well, there are progressive trade unions. Let me mention one in particular. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, TUID, it's known as, and you can look them up on, you know, on the web. They're thinking very much about how do you protect workers and laborers. They're an international coalition of labor unions, and they're also very concerned with the environment and expediting that transition. So there's a lot of good work out there about how it can be done. Let me also recommend Gar Alperovitz, who is a progressive economist, and he is spearheading something called the Next System Project, which looks at all these basic questions, like how do we buy out the oil industry? How do we put it to bed? How do we retire it? Because it's just not capable of doing the right thing. It's, you know, it has to leave most of its energy in the ground, with the exception of the energy we need to build a clean energy system. No corporation will do that. That's like just against their DNA. So they have to be stopped, bought out, retired, something. And, you know, there's very interesting proposals about how that can be done at his website. And again, that's the Next System Project. So I just want to say that this idea that we have to choose between our workers and theirs is exactly how they want us to think. They want us to be inside of this box, and we don't have to be. You know, we actually can create an America and a world that works for all of us. I just want to be sure that everyone has a chance to speak once before we go.
I just want to paraphrase really quick.
Can we come back to you? It's amazing. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of what you say, it's great, right? Like, your heart's in the right place and everything. But my question is, like, how do you guys actually plan on, like, having a strong political stance so that the voter doesn't confuse you guys with, you know, Democrats? Because a lot of what you say, right, it goes towards the Democrats. And you guys are saying that you're going to be taking away, you know, from, or you guys are going to be using the votes of people that don't vote, right? But what's to stop Democrats from doing the same thing, right? A political, you know, party in power, right? It's going to want to stay in power. They'll catch on soon, right? So what is it that you guys are offering? And a lot of, like, your ideals, right? They're completely, like, contrast, like opposing, you know, the conservative Republican, you know, ideals, like the military, gender issues, you know, all that stuff, right? So you guys are already isolating yourself from that front, and Democrats and the Green Party are going to be fighting, you know, for the non-voters and the already voters. So how is that going to work? Because, like, all these ideas are great, but unless you guys actually have, like, a standing in which you guys can implement these things, then none of it actually matters.
Right, and that's why it's so important to have an open dialogue. Because right now the system relies on suppressing political opposition, which is really very contrary to basic principles of democracy. Democracy requires open debate. It requires opposition parties in countries that don't have opposition parties, that only have sort of state-sanctioned, state-sanctioned political parties, that's where we consider, democracy shut down in Iran or in Russia, where it's very hard to create alternative political parties. So, we believe that actually in standing up for American ideals, that enables voters to actually be informed. We think voters have not only a right to vote, they have a right to be informed about their vote. And the minute you allow us to the microphone, see, that's what's really dangerous. They don't like us to get to the microphone because we're not only changing the debate, we're winning the debate. Ideals that have basically been put forward by the Green Party, whether you're talking about LGBTQ rights and equal marriage, whether you're talking about green energy and the climate crisis, whether you're talking about healthcare as a human right, whether you're talking about the right to free public higher education. These ideas, have really come from Greens, and now they're being adopted by the Democrats. But if you let us get to the microphone, we can cut through the BS, and we can clarify what the track record is. Because the law is one thing, the talk is another, and people have had it with the talk. So let me just make sure someone else who hasn't had a chance to speak gets a moment.
Questions about your official foreign policy. You have the president two times. So the question would be, if you were to be elected president, what would be your official foreign policy, and what role do you see the U.S. play in global conflict and crisis?
In global what?
Conflicts.
Yes, and crisis. Okay, great. Good question. So, either the law of the jungle prevails or the rule of law prevails, and that's what we stand by at the national level. We have to stand by that at the international level now as well. So it's very important that we respect treaties and that we engage in dialogue and negotiation, and that be our first reflex rather than exercise in the military. And when you have your guns and your bombers and your missiles all over the world, it creates a certain reflex to use your military muscle. So our foreign policy would replace a foreign policy based on economic and military domination, which is kind of the way the current order is structured. We would replace that based on human rights, international law, and diplomacy. And I know that's kind of broad brushstroke, but that's basically how we would be approaching issues. So like in North and South Korea, there's a little hot spot for you. And the issues about the nuclear weapons and all the guns that are ready to go, those guns don't even need to be there, and South Korea doesn't even want them there, But we can deal with that nuclear crisis by getting rid of all nuclear weapons, which is what has been proposed by the majority of nations around the world that are calling for a ban on nuclear weapons and for the elimination of all existing nuclear weapons. That's the answer to the nuclear weapons crisis. And it also strengthens our economy and puts those resources back into healthcare and education. In terms of our role in international conflicts, if we are indeed an exemplary nation, we should be exemplary with our highest ideals, and we should be promoting dialogue and and human rights internationally. War should be absolutely the last option, and we should be helping to promote negotiations. Like as one example, in Syria, we should be promoting a weapons embargo to Syria. Not only the U.S., but Russia and all the other major suppliers of the combatants should put their weapons supply on hold. And then guess what? Then it's just, and besides, this is how the Green New Deal is actually a solution to that crisis, because the minute you have 100% clean renewable energy here domestically, then you no longer need to fight these wars for oil, and all the interest in conflict goes out of the Middle East. So by promoting sustainable, clean, renewable energy and a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, we can basically you know, make war a thing of the past. We'll take one last question here, and then, you know, now I'll let you go on to the rest of your day.
I'd like to get your take on how we deal with the opiate crisis, and it's creating, it's a pretty big thing. And also, now that we see a lot more states legalizing cannabis, what we should do on a federal level with that, and hemp production, and just the whole new industry that's coming along with that.
Yeah. So, you know, certainly on cannabis and hemp, we need to take cannabis and hemp off the list of scheduled drugs because they are not dangerous. Well, certainly they are far less dangerous than tobacco and alcohol. And we should make sure that those industries should be locally controlled and a source of small businesses and local economies. And the first question?
This is the opiate crisis.
Oh, the opiate crisis, yeah. I mean, the opiate crisis is another symptom. You know, it's one of a whole slew of diseases of despair. We need to address, you know, we not only need to, you know, provide Narcan and you know, rehabilitation and treatment on demand and all that. We need to address the drivers of the crisis in the first place and make sure that people have a future, that there is hope, that there are jobs, that there's not a future of debt and, you know, environmental, you know, poisons everywhere you look. You know, we need to treat each other and the world with respect and dignity, and you know, and then a lot of these, and make sure that people have healthy food and air and water and education and jobs, and all these other problems start to take care of themselves. This is the belly of the beast. So keep up your good work. We can have more discussion afterwards, but I want to let people get on to their classes. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, but honestly, I'm not that much. Yeah, I know. We'll see though. But it's already streaming. It should be done. It should be up as soon as it's done. It's live right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you mean